main proposers and the host of the Demon Cost Action. So a quick reminder again to all the people whose travel is sponsored by the Demon Cost Action to sign the sheet outside. You have to sign the sheet every day to receive the reimbursement. So thank you very much in advance. So now I have the greatest pleasure to introduce Taylor Sparks, who we've been admiring from afar for many, many years. And he is bringing revolution to the workshop. So his contribution is the LLM revolution in material science, from data extraction to crystal design. So please go ahead.
It's exciting to be in the workshop talking so much about material discovery. If I go back in time 12 years, and I was talking about data-driven. That better? Oh, yeah. So loud. Okay, so I had to be a little bit picky on what I'm going to cover, but I'm going to start with doing just a very brief introduction to data extraction from the literature, because I once considered this a sort of grand challenge, unsolvable problem for us, which really was the bottleneck in getting materials data. I'm going to talk about how that's been really solved and what people are doing with it. I'm then going to pivot and talk about how LLMs are also helping us change fundamentally the way that we interact with literature. And finally, the thing I'm sort of most excited about is the prospect of using language models for structure generation. We've had some great talks on generative models so far. It's surprising what language models can do. I'm going to tell you about it. Okay, so we'll dive into here's the problem. The problem is that in material science, we don't have this. This is the crystallographic information file that came out in 1991. And because the whole community, really the IUCR, right, the International Union for Crystallographers, because they got together and said, if you're going to publish a new structure, you must put it in this specific format, that led to the rise of all of these awesome databases, which we now use. If you didn't have that, then it was just like the Wild West. People would just put any old format together they wanted, and it wasn't unified. And that's material science. We don't have a materials information file. When you publish a paper, there is no requirement that you present the data at all, let alone in some sort of organized format. So because of that, what has happened is that people tried to pull the data out of the literature in a number of ways. And actually, this doesn't go back very far. These papers, like the early ones in this field, are like 2010. Like this is only about 15 years we've been trying to do this. And I wasn't even aware of it at this time, but these are some of the early papers and stuff that you might have heard before, like Chem Data Extractor and things like that. When I heard of this for the first time, it was in 2017. The paper on the far right, this one by Elsa Olivetti and company, somebody emailed me this paper and I saw her present this at the MRS meeting. And I remember thinking like, wow, this is pretty slick what they're able to do. And like, God bless them for trying, but it's not going to work. I was like, not discounting the effort they put into this. I was like, this is a hard problem. Even using natural language processing, these were really the precursors to the large language models that we now know. It was just a struggle. In some types of articles like patents, it did okay because patents have much more rigid language on how you sort of specify your invention and discovery. But this was a tough sell. And I sort of personally put this away in my mind as like, I don't think we're ever going to solve this problem. Well, I was like, everything changes, right? It was submitted in August of 2017. What happened in June of 2017? Attention is all you need, right? All of a sudden, the Transformer's born the month before this, and boy, they probably wish they had a time machine to go back and redo that with this new tool that arrived, because the new tool gave birth to Cyber, Chem Cyber, Math Cyber, like all these different things, which clearly showed a marked improvement. And so people that were working in this data extraction field got a big lift with this algorithm. And the paper that changed my mind, that told me maybe this is actually going to work, came out in December of 2022. That's when it was on arXiv. It actually got published the next year. This was by the Berkeley folks. It was originally Alex Dunn, and for some reason the author changed to John Dagdalen in the final version. So whatever happened there. But this was a lot better. Now, there were some serious limitations. They were essentially taking the abstract and turning it into structured data. They did this by hand, manual annotation. It's the worst. They did that for 100 examples to get a partially tuned model. Once they had a partially tuned model, it could sort of turn out things on its own. And all they had to do as a human was babysit it to make sure that it did it correctly. They deemed that around 500 examples, they were able to sort of fully fine-tune this and run it. Now, there's a lot of limitations here. they could only do the abstract because token size limitations. They were doing a lot of hand labeling and babysitting, and it ultimately it was using a fairly expensive API. So things had another sort of, I would say, quantum leap in improvement with the arrival of ChatGPT, right? ChatGPT differs from the original GPT that this original model did by using what we now call RLHF, right? Reinforcement learning with human feedback. This provides a really marked improvement because it allows you to achieve alignment in your models. So if your model, in a stochastic process could turn out a bunch of different outputs, the key part of reinforcement learning from human feedback is some sort of human lines these up and says, well, that's the best output, and over here are the worst ones. And so it's a form of additional tuning, if you will, but the term that I use is alignment here. And with this tool, now we have loads and loads and loads of papers out there. There's dozens of these things I'm seeing. We saw some really great ones just this week at the poster session. I don't know if they're using ChatGPT, but tools like this are now able to pull information out of the literature pretty effectively. So that brings us more or less to today. There are a couple other things I should point out. This one, first off, there's additional tools that make it really easy to mine literature. In 2023, Meta released this amazing software, NuGet, right? Neural optical understanding for academic documents. It can take a PDF, which is filled with formulas and superscripts and references, and it can convert it to LaTeX very faithfully. Critically, why this is important is because it can take tables, right? And getting data out of tables was a sort of long-standing problem in data extraction because they're rich with information, but as human eye can sort of line up and see what lines up with what. It's not trivial to make an algorithm to do that, but NuGet does a great job. It can take this table, turn it into markdown language here in the middle, and then you can replot that table in overlay for something, and you see nearly perfect matchup. So we think that we have great tools now available to get data from text. So let's talk about the current state of text extraction in the literature. In material science in particular. Well, when I saw this in 2022, fairly current, the big issues I saw again were token size. You couldn't feed a whole paper to it back then. That's why they only did the abstract. And labeled data. I didn't want to do 500 examples of labeling data for every field. So how do we get past those? Let's talk about, well, we did a preliminary study. This was my students Sterling Baird, Hassan Saeed, and Wade Smallwood did this. We decided to first ask ourselves the question, where does data actually live in material science journals? And so we looked at a bunch of different material science journals, and we examined what type of information is present in the different parts of the paper. Let's take the text, the bodies of the text. You find things like named entities, right? You find things like processing conditions, you find characterization descriptions, and you find outright property labels, right? So the text really has all four things that you'd expect, the four types of data we'd expect to find. Tables kind of do. They're rich in named entities. They don't have as much about processing. They much less commonly present the processing details. They often will have some characterization, and then they're rich in properties. And then figures sort of have the most data. The actual properties that you care about are most richly represented in figures, but you don't find all the other things in the same way. In fact, when we looked at the papers that we examined, this was the rough breakdown we found. Now, this might change if we were to look at another 100 papers, but I think this is fairly representative of my own experience reading papers for 20 years. In other words, text has some of the data. It does not have all of the properties. The properties are found in the figures, right? Which is kind of a bummer, right? Because the tools for pulling data out of figures, again, I would have called a grand challenge. Like, I don't know when that's going to happen. Computer vision is just not good enough to pull that out of figures. Somebody told me when I said that, not even very long ago, this was like in February, somebody told me like, oh, these models are getting pretty good at that though, right? And I said, really? So I tried it out, right? And so where you have a publication just about to come out on this, it'll come out at the end of the month, but some of the early results look like this. This is, XPS data or something where you're seeing counts as a function of binding energy. And when you just take that raw image with no labeling, with no anything, and drop it into some of these multimodal models that are available nowadays and say, grab the data points, it's not bad. Like, take a look at this. What you're seeing is the manual labeling is the darkest blue in the middle. That's what we would get if we were to use, Webplot Digitizer or something. But the light blue points here and the green points here are straight out of ChatGPT and Perplexity. We've since added Pixtral. This is a multimodal model from Mistral that also is pretty good. And my takeaway is I'm honestly surprised it's good as it is. It's shocking that it's getting the general shape of these things. There are some real issues. In some cases, they're capturing the background, and suddenly they're not. The shift of about 2 electron volts, somebody out of domain might be like, that's not so bad, but in domain, we say that's pretty bad. That's a big deal. To get an XPS curve off by that much is going to be really problematic. So there could be some addition, there will be a lot more fine tuning here. The benefit here is with figures, we can generate the data in ways that, we can generate the ground truth very easily and generate the figures and then have this ability to fine tune. So I think we're going to see rapid improvement in this area. But, we looked at a bunch of different data sets and saw generally an ability to do this. On the left is some figure from, I don't know, this is like dielectric constants or what these are. And again, with the three different models, I should plot these separately because it's busy, but they're more or less capturing the trend in ways that are somewhat satisfying. But then you give it something really easy like this one, and you'd think it's going to be able to grab these individual data points, but it doesn't know what to do with this dotted line. Like clearly a human knows that that's some sort of curve fit and that's just a stroke applied to the line, but it has no idea what to do with that. It's thinking those are data points. So definitely some fine tuning needed, but not terrible. And things like this, schematics, it does a phenomenal job with, right? Somebody's clearly describing some sort of materials fabrication process to make something. And if you look at the steps that it's able to identify and put together in a tabular format, it's bang on. Like it's really, really good. So what's the takeaway here? It is possible to go from PDF to text with the tools that are available. And once you get the text, we have great things for pulling out the data. And increasingly, it might even be possible in the very near future to get the data out of the figures, which is where a majority of the data actually lies. That's promising. Now, what do we do about the second problem? If we think that we're going to be able to get the data out, what about the labeled data, right? Something we thought about was the polling file. I just didn't want to hand label 500 examples, but I knew that there were tools out there that you can pay for, like the polling file. If you haven't used the polling file, what does it stand for? The Materials Property Data System, whatever it is, right? Basically, they pay retired engineers, as I understand it, to read papers and to annotate data out of the paper, and then you can pay to have access to that data that's been organized. What's nice, it's in a JSON format. It's like ready to go for machine learning. But it's also, when we actually used this, it was super disappointing. Here's the output for a paper, right? This is some paper on whatever, this Journal of Alloys and Compounds paper. And this is what's in the polling file. Now, the things that are in that table are all correct. Audio's kind of coming and going. But the problem is that it's definitely not the whole story. They will show you one value at one temperature, but in the paper, we see that it's actually reported at like loads of temperatures. So the problem here is that if you're using this as a label for training a model, the model's not going to be able to learn. There's a serious bias in which data point the reader pulled out of it from what was actually present in the text and figures. This is not good labeling data for us, which is a bummer. So if you're not going to have labeled data, then you're back to labeling it yourself. And around this time, my student pointed out, he's like, well, what if we do few-shot learning or structured prompts? This was right when Gemini Pro had come out. Gemini Pro had a really nice user interface that allowed you to do this with pretty minimal effort. So you're going to give your machine, LLM, some sort of description. You're a lean, mean data extracting machine. Here's what I want you to do. But the structured prompt, part of the prompt is that after you give it the general instruction, here what you can load in is an example of what an input might look like. And over here, you can provide an example of what you want it to be as a label. And you don't have to do 500 of these. We did 5 of these, right? I can label 5 things. That's not a big deal. And what's shocking is that with even that minimal amount of few-shot learning here, it does a great job of turning the outputs, right? So for example, here, is an example of what an input might have looked like, and we ask it to organize into structured data, JSON format. You can actually now, with tools like Pydantic, you can give it an exact template that you want it to follow, and it will follow rules. So you don't end up with like 10 different versions of, characterization, naming, or anything. And it works pretty great. So we ran this on 10 papers in this original study. We only gave it 5 examples. And then because there is a stochastic nature to language models, we ran it 5 times to see what the variability was. And then we compared those 5 outputs with something hand labeled by our group that we did during a group meeting on a Wednesday, right? And here's what we find. If you look at the metrics, there's different metrics you can use to score these LLMs. One of the early ones was Rouge. Can't remember what Rouge stands for. But basically, if the output was supposed to be the fox jumps, if that's what you were looking for in the human labeled data set, but the model spat out the hello, a cat, dog, fox jumps, then the precision here is 3 out of 7 because only 3 of the words were correct of the 7 that it pulled, right? But the recall would be perfect, right? So the, fox, and jumps are all there, so it's all there. So just like in other ML models with classification, you can do an F1 score if you want and balance precision versus recall. And I was, if you look at our scores, and I'll show you them in a minute on Rouge, I was pretty bummed at the Rouge scores. They weren't particularly high. And so, what I said originally is like, well, let's just do BERT scores, right? That's what the rest of LLM world does. And if you're not familiar with BERT score, the way that the BERT score works is you take the output of the model, and instead of just doing specific word by word comparisons, a BERT score takes that entire phrase, or however big of a text you want to do it at a time, it turns it into an embedding, a mathematical vector, and then it compares basically the direction of the vectors is essentially what it's doing. Now, this is good for some reasons, right? The sentence, the weather is cold today, and it is freezing today, these have the same meaning, right? Basically. It's not the exact same meaning, but they're fairly close. Rouge score would penalize that because it's using different words, the word order changes. BERT score captures that with similarities. And so I remember telling my students, like, oh, we'll just do BERT score. But the more I've thought about it, I don't think BERT score is what you want for data extraction. I was telling Militia this the other day. Like, I think that when it comes to, here's the actual numbers, right? Our Rouge scores are like 50th percentile. I think this is precision. It might be F1. I have to check my paper. Whereas BERT's a lot better. But again, if you're extracting data, if it's one thing to use BERT scores for, say, like the naming conventions on synthesis routes or something like that, that I'm not as worried about. But actual numbers, I want the actual number. I don't want it to be close-ish. So a little ways to go. And again, this is just one example. I think there's been others that have come out, but my opinion has certainly changed from this is a grand challenge, we're never going to solve this, woe unto us, we don't have materials data, to thinking, boy, I think we have materials data, and I think that we have a way to go about solving this. Okay, let me... So in the sake of time, I want to make sure I have plenty of time for the second one. I'm probably going to skip this middle. We'll come back to it in a minute if we have some time, because it's less cool. And we'll come here. For this next part of my talk, I'm going to talk about how LLMs are doing things like you'd expect them to be good at things like getting data out of literature. After all, they're language models. What's surprising is what they can do in generating new materials. I'll give you an example of this. We have worked on generative models for materials for like 5 years. During COVID, we dove into this. We're all sitting at home, nothing else to do, our labs are closed. So we started getting interested in Gen AI for materials. And we've published some great work. And it's using some of the tools like, I don't know where the guy from before, if he's here, the diffusion models, the GANs, the flow models. We've explored these things. Here's a publication from ours in this area where we explore GANs, for example, in competition with diffusion models. Now, what you saw earlier was that applied towards molecules. We were interested in extended matter, which I think is a much harder problem. Extended matter has you have to worry about crystal symmetry, basically, and how these things pack together, which is complicated. And we built some models that are not bad, right? These are pretty good. And we're not the only ones in this space. Heavens no, there's a lot of people doing this. Even some big companies, like, which one is this? Is this MatterGen? So this is Microsoft with Tianxia, his MatterGen paper. But, Genome, there's the big companies out there are actually surprising. In fact, somebody told me, I was at a Telluride Science meeting, and somebody said that TikTok, ByteDance, right, their parent company, has people who are doing some of this as well, which is just wild. That said, while I think it's really impressive what some of these big companies are doing to generate new materials, there is some limitations with it. One thing that I noticed in literature is that most of these early papers, anyways, were doing unconditioned. Again, you heard earlier this morning about how much cooler it is to do conditioned generation. Now, property-based conditioning is what we've seen mostly in the literature. In fact, MatterGen, the paper that I just showed you a moment ago, that was one of the big things, property-guided materials design. And that's what they showed in their paper. I think they did it off of magnetic moment in one example. They did it off of bulk modulus in another. And this is great. But what I've been thinking about, and what I've been thinking about for a while, was what about descriptions of the structure as well, right? For example, what if you could take this phrase with actual words that actual humans use, like generate a perovskite material with, and then some certain band gap? Or if I talk to my solid state chemist buddies, they would say, if I said, let's design a new lithium ion conductor, they would say, well, in words, they would say, it has to have lithium in the structure. It better have lithium on a partially occupied site. Even better if it has a big thermal displacement parameter. Ooh, if it's got channels or layers, that's going to be a really great thing. What we were curious was, can you take that text description from a domain expert and turn that into an encoding that guides the generation? And you can, actually. And I'm going to show you some of our work for this. So if you look at the tools that are being used for Gen AI, and again, he showed you the four big ones. And if you look in this review article by Aaron Walsh and company, if you look at the architecture they're using, it's mostly the stuff that he showed. It's VAEs, it's GANs, it's diffusion. And then there's this one right here, kind of out of place, this Crystal LLM. It was an autoregressive transformer. This is by Luis Antunes, Keith Richards, and Ricardo Garcrespo. I was on sabbatical in the UK, and I went down to Bath, where Ricardo was. And I remember talking to him, and he's like, hey, we're working on something new, because he saw my talk on diffusion models for generating things. Like, we're using a language model to generate it. And I was like, oh, don't, what a waste of time, dude. Like, don't do this. It's not going to work. I was like, it's a clever idea, but it's not going to work. And I've had to eat my words because it actually does work, to my total surprise. This paper came out, and I was so curious to see what they actually did there. Essentially, if you haven't used a Civ card before, the Civ file right here is just a bunch of text. And at the very top, it shows you the name of the element or whatever, or the formula, I mean. And basically what they did is they trained a autoregressive model. It wasn't even a large language model. It's just an autoregressive. It's just like the transformer decoder network, right? And then they would provide just that first line of the Civ card that they wanted it to create, and they just let it rip. And it kind of wasn't bad. Like it was fairly comparable with the diffusion models that were available at the time that this came out. So I'm talking about like diffCSP, CDVAE, like these are pretty burly diffusion models that were considered state of the art. And in some categories, there's different benchmarks that people use. It was even better, if not on par with them, which is shocking to me that it can take something where there's no crystal graph, there's no idea of normal distances, there's no idea of equivariance, none of that stuff. It's just text, and it's able to sort of generate structures that kind of match, which is wild to me. So they were the first ones here, and then other people have jumped on and started to look at this. Namely, Meta, I think, was one of the second or so big efforts in this area. And they did something different here. They used a proper LLM, right? It's Meta. They've got the compute resource, heaven knows. But they also did some kind of funny stuff. So they did the text conditioning, right? Below is a description. They gave actual text descriptioning, and they had it generate based off of these text descriptions. But they did something funny. They took the Civ card, and I know this is small to see, but basically what they pulled out of that Civ card when they trained their models was just the values for like ABC, alpha, beta, gamma, all the stuff that describes the structure. But they took all the rest of the words out, which is funny because language models are great at understanding words in the context of other words. And then they stripped out all the other words, which I don't think was the move. But regardless, they hit this with a big model. They did Llama 3.170 billion. That's a big model. They fully fine-tuned it because I guess they've got warehouses of servers available. That's a big thing to do. And it was pretty great. Now, that said, when we saw this, I would love to do that, but I don't have that compute at the University of Utah. So we were instead looking at Llama 3.18 billion, a lot smaller of a model with comparable-ish performance, still pretty good performance. And again, fine-tuning it was the real issue. If you look at the size of that model with 8 billion parameters, the number of weights that you have to requires memory that we didn't have available to us. But there's ways to cheat and get around this. Q low rank adapters is one of these ways. Essentially, you don't mess with the pre-trained weights of Llama. Instead, you train two other matrices, which when multiplied by one another have the same dimensions. It's kind of a trick. And so the actual number of parameters is way fewer. And you see some degradation in performance, but it's not terrible. So this Q low rank adaptation, we tried both 16-bit and 4-bit, and it worked a little bit better. So here's the overall architecture we came up with. We're going to take this open source model. We're going to fine tune it. We're going to use materials project data to do that. So we're going to take examples of stable materials. Now we're going to be able to provide a prompt description of what we want it to generate, and we'll see what it can actually spit out. Here's examples of the inputs. Again, it's just like, hey, you're going to get instructions. We want you to generate a Civ card that matches the request. Then the instruction is generate a Civ card for the given material description, and our input would be something like, the material composition is that formula, and it's in this space group, right? Or you could do other things. You could say, it has this formula and it has to have this energy above the whole, meaning make us a stable one. You could provide whatever text you want. And then let's see in action. So again, it's just going to overview the architecture that we put together here. And now in real time, you're going to see my student Trupti, who did this, provide a prompt description of what she's looking for. So up here at the top, she wants this formula, whatever that is, and she wants it to have the space group 225, and boom, we're off to the races. It is faster than diffusion models. It is slower than our GANs for sure, but it's not too bad. Like you can generate, this is in real time, you're seeing it. So this is something where you could churn out thousands and thousands of these in a day. So you can generate a lot of things. Ultimately, it's going to finish the sieve card. And once you finish the sieve card, there's lots of great tools for analyzing that card to see if it's correct. PyMatGen has some great ones. You could pull these things up, and then you could compare this outputted structure to see if it really matched, had you known what the real structure should look like for that formula in that space group, you could see if it matches. And what we find is that it actually matches pretty well, right? So what you're seeing here is our match rate as a function of how many shots did we give it to try and match it. Like just one, if you asked it one time to match, on average, it gets it right about 60% of the time. And my student Trippi's grumpy about this, saying, oh, that's such a bummer. But I'm just like blown away. You can ask a language model with very modest fine tuning to predict the exact structure, like exact space group and all, and it gets it right over like one out of two times is amazing. If you give it 20 shots, like it's really odds go up to like almost 80%, which is amazing. And you're doing this in a conditional way where you're making it make a very specific type of structure. It's wild. Now, the tools we used here came from PyMatGen. There is technically a site tolerance, fractional length tolerance, and an angle tolerance. And we just didn't monkey with this. We just left it at the basic values that everyone else uses. So I don't know if these are like really close or like not all that close. We just did what everyone else does. And the fact is that it matches pretty well. It is a little bit specific on the space groups. This is a totally unbalanced data set. If you know anything about space groups, while there's 230 unique symmetries that can exist, like 10 of those dominate, right? And so some of those that are way overrepresented in the data that we trained on, like space group 225, is just nature loves it, right? The errors are super duper low. And other ones where we don't have as much data, yeah, they're a little bit higher, but in all cases, it's pretty good. There were times when it got it wrong. When we looked at this, these were things where the structure was deemed valid, but we know that there's still something wrong here. It almost always had to do with atoms getting switched on the wrong spot, right? The yellows were where the blues are, the reds and greens got swapped. In other words, it's the same motif, it's the decoration of atoms that's off. That was fairly common. And there were times when it would return an invalid structure outright, where it just said, hey, this structure can't actually work. Here's one, for example. The actual sieve card for this compound is over here. Obviously, I never saw that during the training. And when we have it try and predict that structure, it looks fine until you notice right here, because it's a language model, it can just spit out text. Instead of giving you numbers for the XYZ position, it's dropped in gdyn.com. I don't know what that is. I should check that. It keeps coming up in my talk and I forget to go look at it. So I know what that is. But the language model will do some weird stuff like that occasionally. It's actually a very low rate of occurrence, but it does happen. It'll do some other things that are tricky. Like this one was deemed invalid, and now you have to be a domain expert to realize what's going wrong here. These structures sort of look okay, but when you look closer, it's putting lithium on the half side at 100%, and then it's putting silver at the half side at 100%. You can't do that, right? So there are subtle things like that where there's no physics involved in the language model. It's not constrained. It's not like a symmetry-aware constrained process where you could do. We fix these with graph neural networks. We haven't done these with language models, so it's making little bumbles like this, but it's not bad. Other times it'll tell you that it obeyed the formula. You told it to make what we wanted the sieve to be like 12:3 ratio of aluminum to molybdenum, but it actually did 12:4 because it'll get the Wyckoff site wrong. It'll put it on the wrong site. But for the most part, I'm just blown away. I'm absolutely blown away at how good these silly language models are at a task that seemingly to me involved so much domain knowledge and so many ways where it could go wrong. I'm pretty blown away that it's as good as it is. Here you can see some comparisons if you want more proof that these are working okay. What you're seeing here in these 7 plots, you're comparing the training data with the output data for things like, well, what was the A size or the B size or the C or the, I can't even read these, the lattice angles, whatever. What you're hoping to see is if a model can train on a data set that when it generates things on its own, it's going to more or less look like the same histogram, and it seems to be. Another way you could ask it is you could say, when it generates things, what did it train on? In this case, the gray data points shown in TS&E or PCA space. And then when it generates structures, is it sort of pulling from the whole space that's available to it, or is it really biased? And it's more or less pulling from the space that's available to it. Now, ultimately, what that means is that we have the ability with a new approach, a new tool to generate structures where we can provide very specific descriptions. Now, what I haven't shown you is examples of me saying, give me channels, give me large thermal displacements. What we're missing to make that part of it work is labeled data. We have lots of sieve cards. Sieve cards don't say this has a channel. like it does have things like thermal displacement parameters. You could go about and pull, you could probably generate descriptions of whether or not there's shared occupancy and things like that. But there is still a lacking data problem here, and there's tools for addressing this, like robocrystallographer is something that we've been using to provide text labeled descriptions of the structure. It's okay. There are some data sets where this has been done in the zeolite field, for example. They talk a lot about building blocks and how they're connected, and there's libraries that describe this. So we're doing the fine tuning on that, but I don't have results for you today on that actually working. I think it's going to. It may not, but I think it's going to work. But let's say even if you let's take me on my faith, take it on my faith for a minute, that we can generate structures that are now going to do this. I think that it also presents a bit of a paradigm and a paradox, maybe is the word, in that it's a bit puzzling what we're going to do, because on one hand, we're generating structures that seem to be matching the training data set, which is pretty exciting. And you can read this, by the way, it's in ChemArchive. But it poses this question. Have you seen these things where it'll train off of some artwork or whatever, right? In this case, this is the girl with the pearl, famous European painting. And then you can have a model train on that and then riff on it, like just say, keep on making versions of it, and it'll make versions. And so you might ask yourself, which of these versions is the closest to the original? Or conversely, which one's the most novel? Which is the most novel variation on this, right? We heard Silvana talk about novelty the other day in terms of elemental novelty, and she talked about her tool using the petaphor scale. We're big fans of the element movers distance, similar approach, and we published this a couple of years ago in our Discover algorithm, it's meant to work in concert with these generative models. While your generative model can crank out new materials, what the Discover algorithm can do is assess you with an actual number, an actual way of being quantifiable about it, how novel that new structure is in terms of things that it's seen before. And what we have under review right now, under revision actually at this point, is the same thing but for structure. We use descriptors that describe the local structure of a material, and now in the exact same way we can quantify how similar or unique something is from a structural perspective. Because the whole idea of these generative models, the paradox is this, right? Oh, I got rid of my slide. As the histograms match more and more closely, the problem is that it's going to generate things that just look like what it's seen before. But what we want the Gen AI to do is generate things kind of like it. So I think we run the risk of overfitting to this training data set, and we actually want a little bit of fudge factor. We want the gdyn.coms, right? We don't want that sort of thing. But we want slightly goofy structures to show up, because if you over-constrain it, we lose the ability to extrapolate out to interesting new materials. And what we were missing for the longest time were tools for measuring interestingness. And I think that we've got two good ones here for people to take a look at. Okay, I'll wrap up because I want to save some time for questions. And I'll just say that everything that I've heard here this week would be a great fit for the journal Integrating Materials Manufacturing Innovation, if you don't mind my quick commercial. I'm the editor-in-chief there. I think it's a great place to publish because it's a professional society journal. It's part of TMS. If you're a member of TMS, I hope you are. You get free access to it. It's published through Springer. It's got a decent impact factor. And importantly for this audience, we publish the sort of stuff that is sometimes hard to find a home for in other places. We publish data sets, we publish descriptors, we publish software GUI packages, we publish regular research articles, all the above, reviews as well. And something I'm really proud of in that journal is I am really passionate about scientific communication, and every article that comes in, it's not required, but I offer them. I will put together a little YouTube video for you on this. We call these our editor video summaries, where I describe the work in plain English, at least to the best of my ability. I talk to the authors a little bit. And these show up with the article. What we're seeing is that this is leading to much higher rates of downloads, citation. I think it's a real differentiator. It's a lot of work we're putting into. We think it's going to pay off to make this journal pretty awesome. Okay, with that said, I'm very passionate about communication and also education. We've got resources available for learning materials informatics. I think I've got one of the best courses out there online. It's freely available on GitHub and YouTube. And we also have a podcast, which I'm psyched about, where we talk about this sort of stuff and other things related to material science about twice a month. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much. This was amazing stuff. I'm sure we have lots of questions. Who would like to go first? Maybe you can go first.
Thank you so much for this very interesting talk. And actually, I have a doubt because, as you mentioned, you trained a big language model of 8 billion parameters, and then you can fine tune it to for different properties. And I assume this can be a mainstream in the future, and it can be a very hotspot research field. But given this situation, like, what about the niche models, like based on physics? Um, I mean, will it possible to integrate the physical information or knowledge into the language model and then make it more reliable? Because we know, like, sometimes, like, the contents generated by ChatGPT can be unreliable. Maybe it seems plausible, but you can easily falsify it. I mean, maybe the language model in chemical field will show the same problem, I guess.
It's a really great question. And I actually love the doubts. I hope you guys all challenged. We were at Northwestern and Ken Poppelmeyer told me the same thing. He's like, we have all this physics, we have all this understanding, like put it in the model. We have a proposal. It's been submitted on ideas for how we're going to do that. So I'm not going to tip my cards on how we think we're going to do that, but I think it might be possible. I'll say this in the same way that graph neural networks didn't contain physics at first, that enforced laws of symmetry, for example. We think it might be possible to do the same thing with language models. So it's not done yet, but I think there's ways to go about it.
Thank you pretty much.
Thanks, Taylor. That was a really inspiring talk. Dare I say paradigm shifting? The cringe. So yeah, my question is maybe a little bit more, looking to the future. So, earlier this year, DeepSeek made headlines with their, GRPO models. Do you think that that has a lot of potential in materials design, or do you think that from what your group is seeing that perhaps it's better for language than it is for materials discovery?
It's a really good question. Ultimately, let me make sure I'm understanding your question rightly. Like, are these really low cost models going to be disruptive to, are we going to have to rely on 8 billion parameter models?
Yeah, and also sort of the thinking tokens as well, and that extra bit of like thinking time. Yeah.
So I think in both cases, the answer is yes. These lightweight models are great because ultimately we're going to do a massive fine tune on it anyways. So the underlying model doesn't have to be perfect by any means if you have data to fine tune it. And then the second part is, agentic or chain of thought processes can make this far better. For example, and we've actually implemented this. One thing that my student Trupti is working on right now, it's not published yet in our original draft of the paper, in the second paper will be, is let's take the ones where it's disqualified, and before a human has to disqualify it, what if you just took a model and you built a reinforcement learning feedback loop that says it didn't pass the structure test, right? The structure matcher test. Therefore, that could be a conditioner during the reinforcement learning. That'd be a very simple one. Or you could take that further and an agent could actually look at this and say, this is text where I know there's only supposed to be numbers. And so you could have something that checks that or revises on that, right? So agentic processes, I think, are also, in other words, we're just getting started. Like, this is early days and there's a lot of tools still left in our quiver that we can sort of try on this.
And put them in an ensemble.
Absolutely.
Great talk, Taylor. Very nice. Two questions. First question is, have you done any studies on systematically increasing the fine-tuning data set, right? Like, you use the materials project data, crystal structure data to fine-tune, and then you're predicting CIF files for new cases, right? So have you done that same thing by systematically increasing the training examples? And do you see, like, some sort of increase in performance and then
Good question.
saturation or drop-off? That's question one.
Okay.
Second question is related to the first. Have you done studies on how the performance is as a function of the crystal size, number of atoms in the CIF file,
Yes.
right? As you keep increasing it, because it's a language model, and at this point, it does not know the physics. That was the first question. As the system size increases, is it hallucinating more and more as it gets to the bottom of the CIF file?
Oh, interesting. Yeah. There's been some of this. Yeah, here's an example, right? This is Parav 5. That means 5 atoms in the unit cell. Carbon 24, MP20, MPTS 52. So in other words, what you're seeing here is number of atoms per unit cell increasing. And you can see for yourself what the RMSE and the match rates are. And It is a function of the size of the atoms for the unit cell. Again, this is from the meta paper. We haven't fully reproduced this because there's a lot of computing to do. But we're seeing general things that, yeah, it certainly does better at smaller structures. The bigger they are, the odds of it going wrong statistically are higher. And so unsurprisingly, the match rate does go down a bit as you're looking at bigger structures. Your first question is a little more interesting, though. Like, we know that all these Gen AI models are data hungry. So can we quantify just what that trade-off looks like? We haven't done it, and we haven't looked at balance yet. We know that it's there, but we haven't quantified either of those things. This is just like you're seeing stuff that's still under review, right? This is hot off the press, but these are really great things to explore.
One more question, if I may, a very high general question. You mentioned many times that this is a language model. Why would it work for this use case? Do you have any insights on why it is doing as well as it is?
No, why can you train off of idiots on Reddit talking about college football and have it predict crystal structures? Like, I don't know why it's able to do that, other than really what you're giving it is a relatively robust and flexible model, and then you're giving it a lot of data to fine tune. So in other words, the starting model doesn't matter that much. And I think we see that because, again, we took an 8 billion versus 70 billion, and we get basically the same performance. The magic is in the fine tuning, right? As long as your model is sufficiently complex to be malleable to the data, then it's the data that you're fitting it to that really matters, is my takeaway.
Is it possible that the base models have been trained a lot on structure files? These can write code, right? They can write code well.
That's a great question. Like, have they seen the ICSD and somewhere in their process? I don't know. Like, they've seen Materials Project. Maybe our friends from, I don't know if Reese knows this or what. I would guess they've seen some or all of this, but I don't know that for sure.
Okay, it's on. Thank you for your talk. Very quick question. So now we talked about crystals, and crystal is in the name, and space group was a crucial information. But do you think this LLM application could be also doable for amorphous systems, maybe looking at local coordination in the future?
That's a really good question. And the 12 years that I've been in this field of materials informatics, amorphous materials has been a bugaboo that whole time for me, because it's the description, it's the representation, right? That we really don't have a great one for amorphous materials. And admittedly, I'm not an amorphous material expert. And so other than things like PDF and things like that kind of tools is kind of my limit to what I understand about how you'd go about representing them. And in the absence of that, I don't know how you go about training on them if you don't have that good representation format of the data itself, let alone the data about it. That's always been my hang up. But again, there's smarter people, glass experts that could probably give a better answer there.
Yeah, thank you for the great presentation. Perhaps you mentioned about this. I just want you to comment explicitly. So what is the agreement between energy above the hull predicted by the model and the DFT benchmarks, if you did any?
I have to check, like when we conditioned it and said, give me something with a very specific one, I'd have to ask my student troop. I don't know the answer to that offhand. It's probably in our preprint, but I don't remember that exact question you're asking. I don't know that one. I know that in our generated structures, before we started language conditioning, we could go ahead and generate structures and then ask, does the generated structure actually exist in the stable? If you try and relax that structure, is it the stable structure? And we found that, and again, I'm not a DFT person, but essentially I'm told by my DFT friends that you can, in the DFT relaxation process, you can track how much the atoms move. And if they move a lot, that's a bad thing. It means you weren't close to the stable structure, I guess. And in the ones that we published in our digital discovery paper, they didn't move very much, right? There was very minor relaxing. So we think that we're fairly close to the final structure. Now, is that also true for the conditionally generated ones? I don't know that. It's a good question.
Thanks, Ella, for this great talk and a lot of cool studies you've done. I want to go back a bit to your early start of extracting information, and I see the importance of that. We have a lot of historic data. Also at companies, we have a lot of handwritten and electronic notebooks, and we want to extract all of those things also from figures. But you're also an editor, right? So right now you try to extract data from figures where maybe the data should be provided in a different format looking forward to the future, right? So how do you see us changing maybe the making data available, the publishing, the maybe we
Great
need to
question.
require from all of ourselves kind of better ways how to share this type of data. Have you some insights how we can do that better?
Yeah. So I've been an editor-in-chief only since this year, but editor at like CompMat for 5 years. And there, any paper that was data-driven, where in order to reproduce the work, you have to have the data in the code to do it. I was a real stickler about that. I hope I didn't reject any of your papers, but I sent every paper back that didn't have the data in the code. I had to get permission from my editor-in-chief and from the publisher. I said, hey, if I do this, this might impact us. And they were like, okay, we're gonna let you do it, because everyone gives lip service to fair data. And I actually put it into practice as an editor, and I was surprised. Again, 19 out of 20 papers didn't have it, but when I would push back, the vast majority, only 1 or 2 out of those would say, we're going to publish somewhere else. People, I think, are willing to if there's a little bit of pushback, but there's this carrot and stick approach. Like, I was being like the bad guys, the editor, saying, if you want to publish here, I did like what IUCR did. I said, you have to present that. But that wasn't for all the data. That was just for data-driven studies where the data they already had it. It's just whether they wanted to share it or not. What you're describing is an extra step of difficulty. And their journals are really scared. And I have talked to Springer about this, and they're like, you're not allowed to do this. Because what they're afraid of is me adding an activation energy to IMMI. And if, author X out there says, I'll just publish somewhere else. There's no shortage of great outlets out there. And they're afraid of being that first mover. So on the other end, I tried to talk to people like NSF. Like, you have data management plans. You tell us we're supposed to obey. Nobody's obeying these things. Like, nobody is providing their data, but they don't want to enforce it either. And so I was just annoyed about this for 10 years. And ultimately, I'm not annoyed anymore, because language models are very good at pulling this data out. And soon vision models are going to be able to get it from our figures. I've gone from being a grumpy skeptic to being pretty optimistic. And then the other question is, I know we're way over time. Last thing I'll say is this. I don't know who showed it, but 200,000 papers are published this year. And it's increasing basically exponentially in most fields. We are having maybe a bit of a slowdown. But in other words, there's more science happening now than there has ever been in the past. All that matters is that we fix it going forward, and we don't necessarily have to go back and catch the old stuff, because it's going to be exponential. We just need to have tools that catch it going forward. So it's more important than ever to build these language models.
Thank you, everybody. And this is a perfect introduction to the next stage in our program, which is a discussion. So everybody prepare weighty, difficult questions for our panelists. But not yet. So I can see that the coffee is served outside. So everybody can take like a 10-minute break. Wait, 1 second. Before you come back with your coffee and everything. And then by then we will set up the panel discussion and we will start. But now Patrick has an announcement as well.
Just quickly, we found a charger in the room. So somebody is missing a laptop charger. It's up front here.